Hello, hello, hi. Check, check, one, two, three. Can you hear me, Kostal?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I think our guest has already joined.
Okay. Hello,
Yeah,
hello,
hi.
Aniket.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Good evening.
Um, Kostal, shall we wait for the students to join?
I think we can wait. I think a number may rise within few minutes.
Okay, let's wait. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening,
So I
sir.
think just wait for 10 minutes, then we can start for that program.
Yes, sir.
Very good evening. Am I audible, Costa?
Yes, perfectly audible.
Okay, thank you. Very good evening to everyone present here. Uh, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's special lecture on understanding India under the hubs of learning through cluster approach consisting of schools and higher education institutes of West Bengal, organized by APC Roy Government College under Faculty Exchange Program and in collaboration in teaching and learning. In order to provide undergraduate students with the necessary life skills and to increase their career prospects, UGC has recommended one of the value-added course known as Understanding India. This paper basically aims to familiarize students with trajectories of a country's geographical, social, historical, and economic development, as well as major scientific technological contribution of India to world's civilization. With this, on behalf of APC Roy Government College, I take this opportunity to welcome today's guest lecturer, Dr. Aniket Tathagata Chhetry, for his lecture on understanding India. Now, Dr. Aniket Tathagata Chhetry finished his doctorate from Delhi University and worked on pre-modern frontiers of Bengal. After having taught in several colleges across the country, he is currently serving as an assistant professor in the Department of History in Siliguri College. Dr. Chhetry is the current Charles Wallace Visiting Fellow at the University of Leeds and has delivered several lectures in prominent universities around the world. It's an honor, sir, to have you with us today. Before we begin with the session, I request our officer in charge, Dr. Mayuk Sarkar, sir, to kindly share some few words. Sir?
Thank you, Professor Abriti. I welcome Dr. Tathagata Aniket Tathagata Chhetry to this valuable lectures one. As you all know, that the hubs of learning through cluster subsets consisting of the schools and the higher educational institutions going to be started from today onwards with the things one. Today, our honorable MIC, he has inaugurated this program because this is the one of the part of the faculty exchange program, and there will be the colleges. That is the my college is the APC Government College is the hub college, and there will be the other colleges also. That is the spoke colleges. So in the spoke colleges, the Siliguri College, the Siliguri College of Commerce, the Mohila College, and in the Darjeeling, the St. Joseph's College and the Southfield College is the cluster colleges. Okay. And there will be the collaborations between the two things. That one is the vertical collaboration. This is with the between the schools and the colleges, and there will be the between the colleges and colleges one. So all the things, that is the horizontal collaboration and the vertical collaborations, and based on this we have started this series, that lecture series. It will continue definitely within we have time frame that up to the December we'll try to do this type of lectures and the workshops, then projects. Okay. So, and after that, definitely from the month of January onwards, we'll discuss that matter with the vertical collaboration between the schools and the colleges. Definitely, the students will get benefit from this type of approach. And automatically, whenever we are talking about any type of shortfalls for the classes, definitely we'll get some ideas. For that, we have Understanding India is one of the important value-added course for the students who have joined the first semester 4 years that model honors courses. So definitely it will be beneficial for the every students who have joined in this course, and definitely that Dr. Chhetry is competent enough to deliver this type of lectures. And I am thankful my teachers and the staff members, my teachers council secretary, and all the faculty members that to organize, especially the Kostov and the Abriti. So they have done a wonderful job. So for organizing this lecture within a very short period, because yesterday only we have finalized this program, and today we have started this program. I think hope that one students will get the benefit. All the hills and plain colleges students who have joined in this lecture note, definitely they will get the benefit. So I welcome Dr. Chhetry to deliver the speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. Thank you, Professor Abruti, for that very lovely and kind welcome. I would like to, first of all, thank APC College for inviting me for today's lecture. And I hope to, in the course of the next 45 to 50 minutes, be able to throw a few pointers upon this particular topic that has been selected, which is India. I hope I'm audible to everyone. So I'll start at that. And at the end of the session, if there are any questions, I will take them. So if you have noticed your understanding India syllabus, you will most probably find that it's a very broad syllabus which tries to impart to every first semester student a brief insight into the historical, economic, and political ideas that went on to shape how India today looks like. Because when we are talking about India in the 21st century as a superpower, as a global power, one cannot ignore the fact that there is a long historical, social, and economic tradition that we had to traverse over centuries to reach where we have now reached. And keeping that in mind, I feel this particular course has been designed. Now, it is very difficult to cover this entire course in the course of one lecture. So what I've planned for today's class or today's special lecture is to focus on certain sections, and if they make sense, maybe in the future we can hopefully, under the leadership of APC Roy College, we can hopefully have few more such sessions with other eminent personalities coming through. So with that brief introduction, just to spatially locate where I'm going to talk about, if you have noticed your syllabus, you will find that there are two major sections and three major subsections which basically focus on Indian history. Now, I today want to primarily talk about one such subsection, which is basically talking about the religious transition that took place. And that is a very important theme because in India, what makes India so unique is the kind of eclectic religious pluralism that is seen across the country, where there are different religious identities and different religious traditions which coexist together. Now, in order to understand how we as a superpower are in a position, and this is to keep in mind that India today is perhaps one of the most coexistent places in the world where we do not get to see major religious confrontations. So where does this come from? This obviously comes from a history where different religious ideas and different religious traditions have coexisted together. Now, when I use the word coexistence, I do not mean that there have been no conflicts, because coexistence means that there will be some amount of tension at certain points of time. But the structures, the religious traditions, and the religious identities have been robust enough to transcend these kind of conflicts and create a pluralistic atmosphere where everyone could coexist. So, to give an idea about this mosaic and eclectic pattern of religious traditions that shapes today's India, it is important to start from the very beginning. And our discussion will also start from the beginning, which is basically, I would want to start my lecture from what we know as the Vedic Hinduism or the Vedic ideas that permeated Indian society. Now, all of you know that in India, after the period that has been characterized as the lithic culture, so we had the Paleolithic culture or the Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic culture, the Neolithic culture, and the Chalcolithic cultures. These cultures in India led to a urbanization and a civilizational phase, which is known as the Harappan civilization. Now, did Harappan civilization, or what we know as the Indus Valley civilization, have a religion? Yes, it did. But the religion they had was not institutionalized or organized. Rather, what we do know is there were a series of temples, and these temples had priests who perhaps enjoyed both spiritual and political powers. We also know that there was a tradition of sacrifices, because from certain Harappan sites we have found sacrificial altars, important among them being Kalibangan. And we also know that there was a tradition of worshipping fertility cults. Now, from that and the decline of the Harappan civilization led to what we know as the Aryan Age. There have been debates about the origin of this Aryan group, with certain historians talking about the indigeneity of the Aryans, while there are certain historians who are very confident of the fact that Aryans migrated from outside. Without getting into this contentious debate, because that does not directly come under the purview of the syllabus that has been prescribed by the university, we will more importantly focus upon the continuation and coexistence of religious traditions. Now, the coming of the coming of Aryan culture, or what is known as the Vedic culture, did see the growth of a new religious tradition. Now, what kind of religious tradition was this, and how different was it from what we get to see in the Harappan period? In one word, it was very different, because we do not get to see the kind of shambolic religious beliefs that characterize the Harappan phase. We do not get to see a predominance of fertility cults. Rather, what we get to see in the Vedic period, especially from the period 1500 BC to 1000 BC, what is primarily identified as the early Vedic age, what we do get to see are two very interesting features. One, economically, we are in a pastoral society where cow is perhaps the most important source of economic wealth. And as far as religion is concerned, we are in a period when the Vedic society or the Vedic people worshipped different elements of nature. So we have reference to the fire god Agni, we have reference to the sun god Surya, we have reference to Varun, who at times is seen as the god of wind, who at times is seen as the god of water. Now, what were the kind of motivations that forced people to worship these natural elements? Obviously, there was a sense of insecurity. There was a sense of fear, because at this point of time, people did not quite know how natural phenomenon took place. So if there was an earthquake, or there was extensive rainfall, or there was a devastating fire, and all of this had material consequences. So people did not quite know how to explain these natural phenomena. And when people cannot explain something, they obviously resort to believing in the supernatural. And that is where there was this particular religious tradition which came about, where there was a glorification of forces and elements of nature. However, if this was the only characteristic, we could have safely assumed that the Vedic age was very animistic. Animism is a term that is sometimes used to talk about that point in human religious inclinations when we worship forces of nature. However, Vedic society was a little bit more distinct. Yes, there was a belief in these forces of nature which were worshipped, but how were they worshipped? Now, here the Vedic texts, primarily the Rig Veda, mentions that worshipping these forces of nature involved pleasing these gods and goddesses. And there was only one way in which these gods and goddesses could be pleased, that was through offering sacrifices. So, if I have to sum up, the early Vedic age was a period when we get to see a certain prominence of sacrifices and ritualism. In fact, sacrifices and ritualism are considered to be important ways through which these forces of nature who are deified could be pleased, kept happy, and their happiness meant perpetuation of the current social, economic, and political traditions. Now, this was the dominant religious facet that characterized the early Vedic age. As we move to a later period, as we move to what we know as the later Vedic age, we find that there are certain changes in the political, economic, and religious traditions. As far as the political and economic traditions are concerned, important changes that took place in the later Vedic society was obviously, as I just mentioned, the early Vedic society or the early Vedic economy was extremely dependent upon cattle as the main source of economic wealth. In the later Vedic age, we find a shift towards agriculture. Obviously, this shift came about because of a shift in the geography of the Vedic civilization. Initially, they were located around a region that is considered to be the Sapta Sindhu area, located in modern day Punjab and beyond, While now, in the later Vedic period, they moved into the much more fertile Ganga, Yamuna, Doab region. But with this geographical shift, took place an economic transition where we find that from being pastoral economies, we are moving towards more agrarian economies. Now, whenever a society moves from pastoralism to agriculture, this is a momentous change. And this kind of an economic change naturally brings about changes in society and religious ideas and even politics. So, just to give an example, in the early Vedic period, when the entire economy was based on cattle wealth, we find that the political traditions were not very definite either. So, all society was based on what we call clans or tribes, and politically there were no kings, there were tribal leaders. Now these tribal leaders were not all powerful, rather their task was to lead the tribe in cases of war, and wars generally took place over cattle. So just to divert a bit, I don't know how many of you have read the Mahabharata, but if you follow the Mahabharata, there's a very interesting episode. So when the Pandavas, after finishing their years of exile in the forest, they have 1 year of Agyatvas where they are staying in disguise, and they go to stay in this particular place called Viratnagar. And it is there that for the first time the Kauravas and the Pandavas come to face. Though the Kauravas do not recognize the Pandavas because they're all in disguise. But the reason why the Pandavas and the Kauravas met each other was a very normal and a very simplistic reason. The Kauravas had attacked the king of Virat for his cattle. So cattle was a source of wealth, and as is normal, all sources of wealth are threatened. And it is here to defend cattle wealth or to steal someone else's cattle wealth. We had the need for a leader who could lead your tribes in defense or to launch attacks. And that is where the tribal leader came into place. So he is not a king yet. But the moment we move towards a more agricultural setup, we find that agriculture brings about production. Production has surplus. That surplus needs distribution. So there's a lot more economic systematization that is evident. And this systematization requires a definite political linkage, which is provided by a king. So as most historians like Romula Thapar would argue, from the early Vedic age to the later Vedic age is not just about a shift from pastoral economy to agrarian economy, but also a shift from a tribal lineage-based political system to a more proto-state system where we get to see the beginnings of a king. So just like there are economic changes, there are political changes, there are also religious changes. What kind of religious changes? It is now that we find that there is a lot more thinking going on, a lot more consciousness comes into choosing the kind of deities we want to worship. We do still have the older gods who are still powerful, like Indra, Agni, Surya, Varun, but we also have these new gods who are coming into play. So we have a brief reference to someone who looks something like a Shiva, so a proto Shiva. We have a proto Brahma by now. All right. Now, when I use the word proto Brahma, I don't mean this is a Brahma cult, but a god who resembles. So all of you are aware that in Brahmanical philosophy, the three gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, represent the Trinity or the cosmic cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction. Now, this understanding of a cosmic cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction becomes a little bit more clearer in the post-Vedic period, leading to the need of a god who is responsible for creation, a god who is responsible for preservation, and a god who is responsible for destruction. So not only do we have the earlier gods who are basically representations of diverse forces of nature, we have a bit more metaphysical elements entering into the religion with ideas of cosmic cycles of creation, preservation, and destruction. However, what does not change is still the mode of worshipping these deities, and there is still a lot of focus on ritualism and sacrifices. So by the end of the Vedic period, and by the end of the Vedic period, I basically mean the end of the later Vedic period, we are reaching a point when, yes, maybe the structure and nature of some of these deities are changing, but there's a still overarching influence of sacrifices, and rituals. Now, here a very important question can then come up is how does then what we now know as classical Hinduism in the modern period evolve? Because we know that Hinduism or Hindu religious traditions is not just about sacrifices or rituals. The changes were all post Vedic. As society became more and more complex, as the economy became more and more complex, as there were diverse political traditions emerging, similarly, religious ideas also became more and more complex. So, what needs to be understood is the emphasis on ritualism, the emphasis on sacrifices had a certain value and a certain resilience in the Vedic period. But as we come or approach the end of the Vedic period, as we move towards more sophisticated forms of state formation, what is characterized as the rise of the territorial states in Indian history, or what we know as the rise of the 16 Mahajanapads, all right, we find that not only do political systems become more complex, but we also find that religious traditions and religious ideas also become much more complex. Now, what kind of complexities are these? Complexities arise from an understanding that maybe the kind of ritualism and the kind of sacrifices that are given so much of importance may not be the only way of worshipping. Now, why are questions being raised? Questions are being raised because the very idea of sacrifices and the very idea of ritualism is not sustainable after a point of time. Firstly, because ritualism or performing various rituals, and understand, when we argue that Vedic society was extremely ritualistic, they were not just one rituals. The entire life cycle of an individual was perpetuated by a series of rituals, right from the moment he was born till the moment he died. So we are talking about an individual through his lifetime having to perform multiple rituals, all of which have a economic burden to keep in mind. And we have to keep in mind as society gets more complex, there is a lot more differentiation of wealth, and everyone may not have the same economic resources at their possession. So it may not be possible for one individual to actually perform all the various rituals as stipulated by Vedic Hinduism and be able to please the gods. And what happens if you cannot perform these rituals? There, the Vedic texts become extremely obstinate. So, salvation, or as Indic tradition knows as moksha, is only possible by pleasing the gods because their happiness is what can gain you salvation. So, if you are not able to perform the rituals, if you are not able to perform the sacrifices expected of you, it might be very difficult for you to please the gods and in turn get salvation. So, the entire emphasis on ritualism and sacrifices was putting a lot of pressure on the differentiated economic society of this period to sustain itself. Understand the kind of expenses these rituals had, understand the kind of bloodshed that each cycle of sacrifices had. You are sacrificing cows, you are sacrificing other animal, all of which are actually part of the economic resource pool of the individuals. So somewhere common people find the ritualistic and sacrifice laden Vedic religious philosophy excruciating and burdensome. And this is where the first resistance to Vedic Hinduism comes from. It comes from within the people. It is not an intrusion from outside. It is not a political reaction. It is more of a reaction from the people themselves. Now, what was the greatest legacy of Hindu tradition? The greatest legacy of Hindu tradition is its adaptability, is the fact that Hinduism is flexible enough to change itself to meet the requirements of the people. So, as the religious leaders realized that there was a certain amount of resistance which is developing from certain sections of society against the excessive ritualism, against the excessive emphasis on sacrifices, they themselves thought of modifying their religion. And what we get from this modification is perhaps the first intervention that takes place in Indic or Hindu religious philosophy, or what I prefer to call Brahmanic religious philosophy, is the rise of Upanishads. What are the Upanishads? Upanishads, like the Veds, are texts. But what is so distinctive about the Upanishads is Upanishad has a very different approach towards religion. and towards the entire metaphysical realm. So far, Vedas focus on rituals and sacrifices, and that is seen as important for salvation. Upanishads, on the other hand, are far more metaphysical. Now, what do I mean by that? Upanishads very clearly, and there are numerous Upanishads. If you want, you can read the English translations of most Upanishads done by Rishi Aurobindo, and that's a fantastic work, I feel. So, if you read some of the Upanishads, you will find that they very clearly mention that ritualism and sacrifices are meaningless. They can never gain moksha. Or, in other words, salvation is not simply possible through rituals. So, somewhere we find that the first reaction that takes place to Vedic philosophy is Upanishad, which actually criticizes ritualism. But if it criticizes something, it has to replace it with something else. So, what does Upanishad give emphasis to? If Veds are all about rituals, all about sacrifices, it's all about how to construct the perfect sacrificial pit, the exact geometrical considerations to keep in mind. Upanishads, on the other hand, give a lot of importance to knowledge. They believe knowledge is the only way through which moksha or salvation is possible. Now, why was this different? It was different because anyone could gain knowledge. So, you don't need money to perform rituals, you don't need money or animals to perform sacrifices. Knowledge is something which is far more easily accessible to people. However, Upanishads were very clear that knowledge did not simply mean bookish knowledge. Knowledge was Gnostic. By Gnostic, it is spelled as Gnostic. Gnostic basically means mystical knowledge. And how do you gain this mystical knowledge? This mystical knowledge comes from introspection. This mystical knowledge comes from contemplation of Atma, of the soul. So understand, here we are getting a little bit more philosophical about things. These terms like Brahma, these terms like Atma were not used in the Rig Veda because they were not given that much importance. It was a very materialistic religion, as it's a very materialistic philosophy of what you need on a daily basis. But now Upanishads are introducing difficult concepts. They are talking about something that every individual possesses, called a soul or an Atma. And Upanishads talk about something that the universe possesses, called the Brahma, or the true reality or the true essence. And what does it argue? That the ultimate aim of human life is to bring about a union between the Atma, that is the individual soul, with the Brahma, that is the universal soul, and only then can you reach salvation. But this union of the Brahma and the Atma is only possible through knowledge. And that knowledge can be achieved through certain mystical means. So here was the catch. This was a little different than what the Vedas were saying. Obviously, it was not so much based upon resources. It did not have that amount of an economic drain on the people. But here they were talking about concepts which are very difficult for average people to understand. It will be too much to feel that a normal peasant or a normal craftsman would suddenly be able to understand the abstract metaphysical ideas that were being espoused in the Upanishads. Brahma, Atma are not terms that even we understand very easily today. All right, and that is exactly where we study specialized things called theology to understand exactly these dimensions. So it's not something easily understandable, and that was a problem of Upanishads. Upanishads did challenge Vedic ritualism, but it replaced it with a sense of Gnostic knowledge, which was not easy for everyone to comprehend. And obviously, whatever is not easily comprehensible never attains the sort of popularity that you perhaps expect with an ideology. So, yes, so if you ask me, were Upanishads successful in criticizing Vedic philosophy? Yes, they were. Were Upanishads very popular? No, they weren't. Why were they not popular? Not because they posed any economic challenge to the Indian society, but because it posed an intellectual problem to the people, which may not have been that easy to be solved. So that is one phase moving into the others. From Vedic Hinduism, we move to Upanishadic philosophy. Now, does it end here? No, it doesn't. Now, what also happens is people are still not happy. Why are people not happy? In the 6th century, when there is massive economic, political, and social changes taking place, people are not happy on one hand with Vedic philosophy because, as I told you, there was too much emphasis on rituals, sacrifices cost money, a lot of animals were being killed, which hurt the economic prospects of peasants. Also, by now, what you have to keep in mind that Vedic philosophy had a definite system of caste. All of you know that caste system, or what we call the Varna system, was extremely indic to our country. And obviously, there were the Chatur Varna from Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. This was a hierarchized ranking system with the Brahmins on top and the Shudras at the bottom. Now, though this system was not as rigid as it has been presented today, in the Rigvedic period, the concepts were there. Obviously, there was some amount of rigidity that comes into being as we move towards the later Vedic period. But what is very important is by the time we come to the post Upanishadic period, the problems are the kind of injunctions that are laid down on certain caste groups, like the Vaishyas. So the Vaishyas were placed below the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas did not like it. Now, most of the Vaishyas in the 6th century were engaged in trade or mercantile activities and had a lot of economic wealth. So they felt that their social status did not match with their economic status, and that is why they had a problem with Vedic philosophy. There was a problem with the overall focus on rituals and sacrifices because it was seen as an economic drain. And obviously, Upanishadic philosophy, no matter how much it challenged Vedic philosophy, was still problematic because it was a little too complex for the common people. So, even in 6th century, we find that not everyone is absolutely very happy with the Brahmanical system. Some feel that it is dominated by Brahmins and Kshatriyas. Some feel it is exploitative. Some feel it's economically draining, and some simply find it obtuse. And in this kind of a circumstance, we do find another form of resistance or another form of introspection that develops. And these new cults that develop in the 6th century and which become very popular later on, there are many such cults. However, I will just mention two of them, very popular and mostly known to most of you: Buddhism and Jainism. Now, Buddhism and Jainism, obviously, both of them develop in the 6th century. Both of them actually emerge from the kind of tensions that are already present within the Brahmanical system. Tensions which are linked to the caste system, tensions which are linked to the kind of emphasis on ritualism and sacrifices, and tensions which come because some people just find Upanishadic philosophy too difficult to understand and introspect. So it is in this kind of a context that we find Jainism and Buddhism emerge. And Jainism and Buddhism are both extremely popular in India at this point of time. Why? Firstly, because of their simplicity. Buddhism and Jainism used the language of the people to promote their ideas. So it's at this point of time, Pali and Prakrit, which is generally spoken by the people, and that is what Buddhist leaders or Buddhist saints and Jain saints used to spread or convey their ideas. Now, so one reason why Buddhism and Jainism was popular was because easily understandable by people, which was not the case with Upanishadic philosophy. Also, the Buddhist and Jain philosophy answers some of the questions or some of the tensions that Vedic Hinduism posed. In the first place, I will not say that Jainism and Buddhism rejected the caste system, because they did not. They questioned the caste system, but they never completely rejected it. However, they were of the belief that all humans are equal and everyone is capable of salvation. And that in itself was perhaps a very radical thing to say at this point of time, because so far the entire Varna system is very hierarchized, where all Varnas have a particular position in the caste system or in the Varna system. Brahmins at the top, Shudras at the bottom. Here, Buddhism and Jainism were talking, yes, they're not rejecting the caste system outright, but they're arguing that maybe it is possible for all Varnas to achieve salvation. Though there are problematic elements even within Buddhism and Jainism. How much of a real lip service did they pay to this idea of equality of all castes is questionable, because Buddha at times even mentioned that it is not possible for a Chandal, quote unquote, to perhaps attain salvation. So, yes, on the one hand, they are extremely liberal, but there are certain problematics as well. But for a large part of the population, especially for the currently economically affluent section of merchants who fall within the traditional Vaishya substratum, Buddhism and Jainism is an option through which they can get social respect along with economic affluence. And that's why a large group of merchants and let's say traders are attracted towards Buddhism and Jainism. We find that most of the earliest followers of Buddha and Mahavir come from these particular subsections. Also, they are the ones who make the most donations at this point of time towards Buddhism and Jainism. Also, what is important is both Buddhism and Jainism very strongly talk about the idea of non-violence or ahimsa, which obviously means that they're criticizing the very prospect and idea that Vedic philosophy promoted of sacrificing. They also question rituals and believe that rituals are meaningless and can never lead to salvation. So here were two new philosophies, what we call heterodox cults, which are actually questioning some of the fundamental truths of Vedic Hinduism. But then comes a question. They may be questioning or criticizing Vedic philosophy, but what do they have to offer in return? What they offered in return varied from Jainism to Buddhism. Jainism, when it talks about moksha, believes that the only way moksha is possible is through penance. That's why the Jains follow penance to the highest possible degree. So they believe that no living being should be consciously or unconsciously hurt. That is why you will find a lot of Jains wear a mask on their faces, because they believe that even when they're breathing, they should not be killing microbes and bacteria, which is kind of like, futile. So Jainism believe, and again, here is a distinction. Vedic philosophy, ritualism, sacrifices, Upanishadic philosophy believes in Gnostic knowledge. And here was Jainism, which is saying, well, not exactly sacrifices, not the rituals, they're not important. What is important is penance. You need to purify your soul, and the only way you can do that is through performing extreme renunciatory activities. So you are supposed to be non-violent, you are not supposed to possess any property, you are not to steal, you are supposed to be absolutely truthful, you are not supposed to even wear clothes, because not wearing clothes is a way of harming yourself. And the more your body is in pain, the more you are able to purify your soul. So that kind of asceticism is what Jainism promoted. That was difficult for most common people. This was also very difficult, and that is why perhaps if we compare Jainism to Buddhism, Buddhism has a more popular base compared to Jainism, because Buddha believed in a lot more moderation, that we don't want to be too given to materialistic pleasures where we are constantly living a hedonistic life, nor do we constantly want to be doing rituals and sacrifices. But that should also not mean that we are putting our body through intense austerity measures. So he did not believe in the sort of penances that Jainism believed in, and his idea was more middle path. That's why Buddhism is also called the middle way. So Buddha believed that all dukkha or suffering in life is because of desire. The only way in which truth and moksha can prevail is if we get rid of desire. Desire is the only reality in life, and the only way we can get rid of desire is by following the Ashtamagika, which is basically the eightfold path. And if you look at the eightfold path, neither is it extremely hedonistic. It does not talk about rituals, sacrifices, nor is it something that requires a lot of knowledge. It does not talk about abstract metaphysical ideas like Upanishad, nor is it extremely difficult to follow like Jainism. Rather, it believes in things like right action, right thought, right speech, right conduct, right meditation, right livelihood, right conscience. All right. So obviously, this is much more possible and realistic for people to follow, because here you did not have to go to any one extreme. And that is why perhaps Jainism could get such a large number of people to follow it. And obviously, as I told you, the very fact that both Jainism and Buddhism though they did not outrightly reject the caste system, but yes, definitely argued about equality of all individuals and the possibility of all individuals to attain salvation, which also made Buddhism and Jainism very popular. So this is how we are outlining the various stages of religious growth. So we had Vedic philosophy, then we moved to Upanishadic philosophy, and then we moved to Buddhism and Jainism. Obviously, the kind of popularity that Buddhism and Jainism had, the kind of support that Buddhism and Jainism got, not just from the common people, from merchants, from traders, but even from the political leaders, the political elites of the state, the rulers. Because somewhere, though the Kshatriyas or the ruling class depended upon the Brahmins for legitimization, because the Brahmins legitimized them. According to the Indic philosophy, post Vedic philosophy, rulers need Brahmins to legitimize them, and the Brahmins legitimize them by presenting them as representatives of God. But in return, a large amount of donations, a large number of gifts needed to be made by the rulers to the Brahmins. So yes, there was a sort of tacit understanding, but somewhere the Kshatriya rulers did feel Brahmanism to be stifling. And that is why we also find that when Buddhism and Jainism emerged as a potential challenge to Brahmanic philosophy, a lot of political leaders also accepted or embraced Buddhism. Examples: Bindusar, Ashok, all of them embraced Buddhism. Why? Because somewhere Buddhism felt more accommodative and maybe gave them a chance to establish their political hegemony over Brahmanic faith. So obviously, what this means is these heterodox cults were very popular. So obviously, as I told you, the biggest quality of Brahmanical philosophy was it was flexible, it could adjust. That's what it does. When it realizes that, well, Buddhism and Jainism are becoming extremely popular, Hinduism once again readjusts its orientations. And that is where again we come across a new version of philosophical thought, which is the Puranic philosophy. What is the Puranic philosophy? Again, based on Purans, which are texts. All right. Uh, this kind of philosophy that the Purans followed were obviously based on an idea of appropriation. Now, what do I mean by an idea of appropriation? Let's put it this way, let's simplify it. There were a lot of people at this point of time who had embraced Buddhism and Jainism. There were a lot of people who were outside the fourfold Varna system, and Brahmanism needed to strengthen itself. So, what did it do? It tried to incorporate all these non-Brahmanical faiths, all these non-Brahmanical cults and deities within its framework. How does it do? Simplest example, even today, if you look at Krishna, although I'm using a very modern example, we talk about the different avatars. You will find in certain traditions, Gautam Buddha is considered to be an avatar of Krishna. This is appropriation. And that is the resilience that Brahmanical philosophy showed. It had the wits to realize that there's a very strong challenge to some of its philosophical traits. What's the way to survive? Why don't we modify ourselves? How do you modify yourself? Not just modifying our teachings, but in fact modifying the very basis of our ideas, where a lot of non-Brahmanical ideas were brought into the Brahmanical fold. And that is why the Puranic philosophy is so significant, because this is where the goddess cult becomes famous. Now all of us are approaching Durga Puja, but what is important to realize is after the Harappan civilization, there is not a great degree of emphasis on female deities. Yes, we do have references to female goddesses in the Veds, but they always assume a secondary position compared to the male gods. Whereas if you look at the Devi Bhagavat, here is an omniscient goddess like Durga, all right, who is knowledge and darkness, who is power and transience. So this kind of an all-knowing, all-encompassing female goddess who has supreme power, who is considered to be the Mahashakti, Adya Shakti, whose basic prototypical form is Durga and Kali, emerges from the Puranic philosophy. So you have to understand that there were a lot of non-Brahmanical traditions prevalent across the subcontinent who actually worshipped fertility cults, who worshipped female goddesses. How does Brahmanism survive? Or how does Brahmanism decide to accommodate itself? It does. How? By constantly trying to put these gods and goddesses within its fold. So Durga itself, the term, is believed to come from Durgi, which means difficult, which probably historians like Sharma, Bhandarkar have argued that has a very non-Aryan origin. But Brahmanism was clever enough to realize that if we need to survive, we need to incorporate all these different ideas into our fold, and maybe that was the only way they could survive. So all non-brahmanical ideas at this point of time, be it local cults, be it Buddhism, be it female goddess cults, were being appropriated within the new Puranic philosophy. So understand, this is the legacy of Hindu philosophy, and where its greatness lies. It is not stagnant. It does not remain bound by one idea. Whenever it faces challenges, whenever it finds that there is tension in society at some level, from its own philosophies, it modulates itself. So, from Vedic Hinduism to Upanishadic philosophy to Puranic philosophy, this is a story of constant evolution and a constant modification of one's thought processes. I know I've just last 10 minutes left just to cut this short story, a long story short, because I guess there are a few questions as well. Just to emphasize on how flexible this religious tradition has been, you just need to look no further than the Bhakti movement. I think Bhakti movement, which developed in India in the 9th century in South India, and then once again resurfaced in the 14th, 15th century in North India. Bhakti movement encapsulates the best example of how resilient and flexible and accommodative Hinduism is. Because here was a kind of philosophy which had never been seen in Hinduism before. Because Bhakti is a complete antithesis to the kind of Vedic philosophy spoken about. Bhakti does not talk about ritualism. Bhakti talks about devotion. It says all you need to earn salvation is not rituals, is not even gyan, it's only devotion. You only need to be emotionally attached to your God in the manner in which it's, let's say, a child is attached to its parents. And that level of emotional commitment and that level of devotion is all that it takes. So here, suddenly, God, from being one who needs to be pleased through knowledge or through ritual, becomes a much more personalized deity who can be worshipped as per your social standing. All it requires is devotion. So here was a idea which is based on just love and sincerity. And that is the beauty of Brahmanical philosophy, or what we call Hinduism, that it could move from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, because it realized that as society became more complex, as society became more economically differentiated, as society became more politically heterogeneous, there were new tensions arising which it could not have contemplated earlier. And to each of these new tensions, to each of these new threats, it reacted in a different manner, all of which was aimed at embracing its problems, changing and evolving its nature, and finding a new pathway to grow. And that is perhaps why Sheldon Pollock talks about the cosmopolis of Sanskritic knowledge, which has moved beyond India to large parts of South Asia, though Pollock's ideas themselves have been questioned. But it is important to keep in mind this flexibility. So from Vedic philosophy to Upanishads to Purans to something like the Bhakti cult, where not only some Bhakti scholars like Kabir are transcendent. They talk about the equality of all individuals. They question the entire idea of caste. They question religious distinctions by arguing about the essential unity of God. They definitely criticize ritualism. They definitely, at certain sections, don't even believe in image worship. So we have a particular school of Bhakti called Nirgun Bhakti, which believes that the eternal reality is formless. It does not have any attribute. So all you need is love and compassion and introspection. That's it. So, but it also had a version which believed in Sagun or idol worship. So there were so many different strands playing out. There was rejection of the caste hierarchies. There is ideas of liberality and equality of all man. There is ideas of compassion, love, and intense devotion coming in. There is ideas which reject patriarchy at certain extent, which people like Meera is doing, which someone like Mahadevi Yakka is doing, which someone like Lal Ded is doing in Kashmir. So that is the resilience of the Brahmanical tradition, which has survived till date and has made it possible to perhaps come to a point where we are talking about understanding India in the 21st century. And this is exactly one of the subtopics that is there. If you see your syllabus itself is framed in a way which makes you think about the evolution of the entire Brahmanical philosophy and how, from a very rudimentary beginning, it became more metaphysical, it became more liberal, it became more devotional, and that allowed Indian society to perhaps accommodate new threats like Buddhism, Jainism, accommodate new economic configurations like the shift from, let's say, pastoralism to agriculture, allowed them to accommodate new political forms. We had foreign invaders coming in right from the 3rd century AD with Greeks. After Alexander's defeat coming in, we had the Bactrian Greeks, we had the Huns, we had the later Muslims. All of them could be accommodated and given a place in Indian society because of this very nature of Hindu philosophy, which is very evolutionary and which is extremely embracive. And that is something which perhaps is the dominant thread in this particular section of your understanding the syllabus. And you have to try to chart out this evolutionary mechanism. Remember, your questions are most probably, as far as I know, are multiple choice questions. So you will get the hint from the question itself. But we need to move beyond simply understanding the syllabus to understanding why that syllabus has been framed. And the basic framers, or the people who drafted the syllabus, wanted students to understand this evolution of religious thought, which actually makes our country so pluralistic and so diverse as it is seen today, where so many different religious traditions could coexist, interact, and even learn from each other. And that's where I would like to perhaps end today's discussion. Thank you for being such a patient and warm crowd, and I will take any questions if there are any. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Chhetry, for such an informative and beautiful speech. And from today's talk, we have came to know about our glorious past and at some extent its implication in our today's life. And I'm pretty sure that all of us has enriched enough after this excellent lecture by Dr. Chhetry. So now the session is open for question and answer. So what I can see in the chat box, one of the student has asked some question. So it is Amit Bashak. So can you unmute yourself and ask the question, Amit? Amit,
Good
are you
evening,
there?
sir.
Yes, please ask the question.
Sir, I read somewhere that Bindusar was a follower of Ajivika. So like Ajivika was also parallel to Buddhism.
That's a very good idea. So, as I told you, in the 6th century, there are various ideas coming. I just focused on because there's a paucity of time, and you cannot discuss everything in one go. All of these need separate lectures in themselves. I was just trying to give a basic idea of it. So maybe I was a little quick in going through it. Buddhism and Jainism are the two most predominant ideas, but there are more ideas. So there is the materialistic school, which was started by Ajita Kesakambalin. There is Makhali Gosala, who came up with the Ajivika philosophy. So these are all different ideas which are present in 6th century BC, apart from obviously the Vedic and Upanishadic strands. But of these two, obviously the two most popular ones were Buddhism and Jainism. So yes, Ajivika is also, or the Ajivika cult is also present, and you are correct when you mentioned about Bindusa's point. So yes, but I unfortunately could not mention it because there are so many different ideas, and because of possibility, you're right. Ajivikas are there. There are the Charvaks, or the materialistic school is there. There are other ideas which are prevalent at this point of time. But I simply wanted to focus upon the two most important ones, which is Buddhism and Jainism. So I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Okay, so there are one more questions. So it is the name is not actually mentioned, student's name. So can you please unmute yourself and ask the questions? The name starts with Manipur. So can you please unmute yourself and ask the question? Okay, so it's Muhammad Ajaruddin. So please unmute yourself.
গুড ইভিনিং স্যার স্যার আমি একটু বাংলাতে বলবো স্যার আপনি যখন আপনি উল্লেখ করেছিলেন যে উপনিষদ ব্রাহ্মণ্য উপনিষদ থেকে যে কাস্ট সিস্টেমটা এনেছিল, তা ওই কাস্ট সিস্টেমটা আনার কি কোনো ইম্পর্টেন্স ছিল ওই সময়? এটা কি কোনো ওই সময়ে মানুষদের জন্য উপকার ছিল, কোনো সহযোগিতা করেছিল মানুষদেরকে ইকোনমিক ভাবে?
See, that's a very good question. See, first of all, as I mentioned, the very ideal, let's use the word Varna system, because caste, the very word caste is a very Portuguese derived word. All right. So let's not use the word caste. We use the word caste for English Anglophone audiences, but the actual Indic word is Varna. Now, আমি বাংলায় বোঝানোর চেষ্টা করছি জাস্ট ফর এ সেক। তো বর্ণ প্রথাটা কিন্তু বৈদিক সময়ে ছিল। ঋগ্বেদে আমরা চতুর্বর্ণের কথা বলছি, অবশ্যই ঋগ্বেদে কিন্তু এই চতুর্বর্ণ ব্যবস্থাটা এতটা কঠিন বা রিজিড হয়ে ওঠেনি। সেখানে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে যদিও 4টে বর্ণ বলা আছে, ব্রাহ্মণ, ক্ষত্রিয়, বৈশ্য, শূদ্র, কিন্তু এদের মধ্যে অনেকটা মোবিলিটি বা মুভমেন্টের স্কোপ আছে। সো ঋগ্বেদের একটা অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ পদ আছে যেখানে বলা হচ্ছে আমি my father is a tanner, my mother is a milkmaid, and I can aspire to be a carpenter. তো কোথাও না কোথাও there was a lot of scope for mobility. এবার কেন কাস্ট সিস্টেম, কেন বর্ণ সিস্টেমটাকে ইন্ট্রোডিউস করা হয়েছে? because you have to realize that we are in a pastoral economy at this period, and obviously we did not have state structures. We had these tribes, and within these tribes we had these various clans. And again, there was something called gotra, which was based again on the number of cows you had, to be very honest. The very term gotra comes from cow, a cow pen. Now, it was very important to maintain the sacrosanctness of occupations. Je kota এই সময় কর্ম আছে, alright, initially you have to understand varna system was also based on occupation, যে কে কোন কাজ করছে, চেষ্টা করা হচ্ছে যে তার পরিবার যেন সেই কাজটাই করে ট্রেডিশনালি। সো ইট হেল্পস ইউ এই সময় যখন আপনার স্টেটের কোনো মার্কার নেই, যেখানে আপনার এই মুহূর্তে লিটারেসি অতটা নেই, অন্য কোনো আইডেন্টিটি মার্কার অতটা হয়তো গুরুত্বপূর্ণ নয়, সেখানে আপনি কি করে একটা সমবেত ভাবে একটা গোষ্ঠীর কাছে রাখবেন, কোনো একটা তো মার্কার লাগবে। এখানে তারা মনে করছেন যে মেবি বর্ণ ব্যবস্থাটা একটা ভালো মার্কার হতে পারে, যে ঠিক আছে যাদের জন্ম ব্রাহ্মণ বর্ণে তারা সবাই পরবর্তী প্রজন্মে তার ছেলে, তাদের পরবর্তী প্রজন্মে ব্রাহ্মণেরই কাজ করে যাবে, যারা ক্ষত্রিয় তারা ক্ষত্রিয়ের কাজ করে যাবে। সো the entire idea was to create an occupational hierarchy in society, and I feel it was done more for systematization, organization basis. Later, obviously the caste system became more rigid, যখন আমরা দেখেছি যে অচ্ছুত প্রথা চলে আসে, যে একটা দলকে সম্পূর্ণ বর্ণ ব্যবস্থার বাইরে বলে মনে হয়, that becomes a problematic aspect because it emerges out of political considerations and economic considerations. যে মুহূর্তে আমরা জমি ভিত্তিক কৃষি অর্থনীতিতে মুভ করে যাচ্ছি, when you're moving towards agriculture, and remember agriculture means your পিউরিটি অফ ব্লাড ইজ ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট, কারণ আপনার পরে আপনার ছেলে বা মেয়ে উত্তরাধিকার সূত্রে পাবে। তো আপনার ছেলে কাকে, আপনার মেয়ে কাকে বিয়ে করবে, আপনার ছেলে কাকে বিয়ে করবে। সো ম্যারেজ লাইন্স বিকামস ইম্পর্টেন্ট, অ্যাজ Engels argues in his very famous tract Family and the Rise of Private Property. So it is about regulating marriages, it is about regulating inheritance, that the caste system যেটা হয়তো আগে শুরু হয়েছিল to systematize occupations becomes much more rigid. তো এটার ইনিশিয়াল কাজ ছিল শুধু সমাজকে আরো বেশি অর্গানাইজ করা, কিন্তু পরবর্তীকালে যেহেতু সমাজ আরো বেশি কমপ্লেক্স হয়ে ওঠে এবং বিবাহ ব্যবস্থা, উত্তরাধিকার সূত্রে অনেক বেশি রেগুলেশনের প্রয়োজন হয়ে যায়, the system itself becomes more and more rigid. I hope that answers your question in a nutshell.
থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার, আমি খুব খুশি হলাম আপনার এই উত্তরটাতে, কারণ আমার আগে থেকে এই জিনিসটার প্রতি একটু অন্যরকম ধারণা ছিল। তো আপনি খুব সুন্দর এটা বোঝালেন যে কাস্ট সিস্টেমটা যে আসলে ইকোনমিক সিস্টেমটাকে উন্নত করার জন্যই এটা বানানো হয়েছে, আমি এটা বুঝতে পারিনি আগে থেকে। স্যার আমি আমার একটা শেষ প্রশ্ন করব যে স্যার আজকের দিনে কি এর সেই সময়টাতে অন্যরকম যুগ ছিল স্যার, তখনকার যুগে মানুষের সংখ্যা কম ছিল, তো মানুষের চাহিদা জব বা কাজের সংখ্যাটা অনেক ছিল, তো সেই হিসাবে যদি ভাগ করে সবাইকে কাজ দেওয়া হয় তো সেই হিসাবে ইকোনমিকটা উন্নত হওয়ারই কথা। কিন্তু স্যার আজকের যুগে দাঁড়িয়ে আমাদের এখানে পপুলেশন অনেক বেশি, আমাদের ডাইভার্সিটি অনেক কম, তো এইখানে কি কাস্ট সিস্টেমটা কাজে লাগবে, আমাদের জন্য হেল্পফুল হবে?
That is why we try to talk about a society free from caste distinctions. Unfortunately, history means we have to bear the historical problems as well that we inherit. Unfortunately, আমরা যে সমস্ত সমস্যাগুলো, আমরা অনেক ভালো জিনিসও পেয়েছি, ঐতিহাসিক সূত্রে কিছু সমস্যারও সম্মুখীন হতে হয়েছে। So we have to live with these traditions. But yes, our governments since independence have tried very hard to try and find solutions to these problems, and hopefully we all dream that in a nearby future we will be able to live in a society where there are lesser caste based exploitations and distinction. That's what we can hope for and aspire for. So yeah.
Unbelievable, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so if there is any more further questions, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good evening, sir.
Please ask.
Sir, as we have seen that in the Vedic era, like there were many female philosophers, giving their philosophies and contributing the Vedas. Were there any other women in the Upanishad, like contributing their knowledge for Upanishads, like written many Upanishadic philosophies like them?
Well, not that I'm aware of. Unfortunately, I am not aware of. All right, because most of the things that I can remember all male oriented. আমি এটা বলবো না যে মহিলাদের কোনো ভূমিকা নেই, মেবি ইটস নট রেকর্ড, মেবি জাস্ট হয়তো এই মুহূর্তে আমার মনে পড়ছে না, বাট আই somehow don't remember any such important female philosopher, let's use that word, in the context of the Upanishads. So I do not seem to remember any. আমার মনে হয় না আমি যতটা পড়েছি আমার কোনো মহিলা দার্শনিক যে উপনিষদের যুক্ত এই মুহূর্তে মনে, বাট দ্যাটস আ গুড কোয়েশ্চেন, যদি আমি ভবিষ্যতে পাই ডেফিনেটলি কাম অ্যাক্রস টু ইউ, বাট এই মুহূর্তে আই ডোন্ট থিঙ্ক সো আই হ্যাভ এনকাউন্টার্ড এনি। তার মানে এই নয় যে মহিলারা দার্শনিক হতে পারেন না বা তারা এই সময় দার্শনিক কাজ করছিলেন না, ইটস জাস্ট দ্যাট সামটাইমস ইউনো বিকজ সোসাইটি ইজ ভেরি পেট্রিয়ার্কাল, আমরা এত পুরুষতান্ত্রিক সমাজে বসবাস করি যে মহিলাদের কন্ট্রিবিউশনটাকে অনেক সময় ছোট করে দেওয়া হয় বা সিম্পলি মুছে দেওয়া হয়। তার মানে এই নয় যে তারা করেননি বা তারা করার কি বলবো they are not able to, it's just that there is an effacement of women. It happens in all aspects. আমি শুধুমাত্র উপনিষদের ক্ষেত্রে বলবো না, maybe there has been effacement of women, but yes, সোসাইটি একবার যখন আমরা ঋগ্বেদ বা আর্লি বেদিক বেদ ছেড়ে বেরিয়ে আসছি টু আ পোস্ট বেদিক এজ, পজিশন অফ ওমেন ডিমিনিশড, রাইট? যতটা স্বাধীনতা মহিলাদের উত্তর বা পূর্ব বৈদিক যুগে দেওয়া হয়েছিল, ততটা স্বাধীনতা ততটা অধিকার কিন্তু মহিলাদের লিটার বেদিক এজে দেওয়া হয়নি। And since the Upanishadic philosophy obviously developed after this, it is very possible we do not get to hear about important female commentators because তারা হয়তো সেই পরিমাণ ছিলেন না। আমি বলবো না একদম ছিলেন না, হয়তো সেই পরিমাণে ছিলেন, যেমন গার্গী আছে, মৈত্রেয়ী আছে, অত্রি আছে, আরো অনেক নাম আমরা ঋগ্বেদের সময় পাচ্ছি, বাট সেই তুলনায় নাম আমার এই মুহূর্তে মনে পড়ছে না, which might be to a certain extent because of the collective effacement that patriarchy believes in, and also to a certain extent because the restrictions imposed on women made it more difficult for them at this point of time to acquire that sort of metaphysical knowledge. If that answers your question, Amit.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, is there any more questions? You can raise your hand or you can directly ask. Okay, so it seems like nobody has no question right now. So thank you, Dr. Chhetry, again to give us such a beautiful great talk. And the way you told that the syllabus of this Understanding India is just not just for pass the examination. It has some importance beyond the syllabus, and that has to understand. And I hope that every student present here had got the flavor of such kind of information that why we need to understand this Understanding India. Now, with this note and with the due permission of our officer in charge, I think we are almost at the end of our program. And we hope that in near future, we'll conduct such program where different colleges, or especially mainly it's spoke colleges and also our hub college, will come together and will conduct such beautiful programs where students will get benefited out of it. And we'll also looking forward to see you, Dr. Chhetry, in near future in such programs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming here. So thank you, everyone. So the program concludes here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.